So let's begin mobilizing our resources for war. Remember what the most basic things are: men and money. At first, raising men posed very little problem for either the North or the South because there were thousands of men who were volunteering to fight. In the early stages of the war, folks believed that the war was going to be short, so men on both sides were very high-spirited for their respective causes and rushed to go help out either side. Northerners rallied to Lincoln's call to preserve the Union. They remembered that Washington had told us in his farewell address that there would be no liberty without the Union. So, in order to preserve the Union, which guaranteed American freedom and liberty, Northern men by the thousands rushed to enlist. Southern men saw themselves also as fighting for their freedom and liberty, which would be secured, of course, by the South winning independence. So, ironically, both Northerners and Southerners saw themselves as fighting to preserve American liberty, one side by preserving the Union, the other side by leaving the Union. However, it became apparent after some months that the war was not going to be short, and then the casualty lists started getting longer. And when those lists started getting longer, enthusiasm for joining the army on either side started to wane. So both sides started to offer cash bonuses that were also called bounties to induce men to join. The North also promised 160 acres of land to men who would join up. Now, this was a pretty good deal, assuming you survived the war, because as a young man, you wouldn't have to save up or take out a mortgage, and you'd have your little family farm. And all you need to add was the wife, 6 kids, a horse, pig, and a dog. Emphasis on the dog. Don't know why they didn't have any cats. Anyway, by 1862 to 1863, even bounties and other rewards weren't enough. So both the North and the South resorted, for the first time in American history, to compulsory military service. This is also called conscription, better known as the draft. Both the North and the South are going to use the draft despite its unpopularity. It was unpopular for a few reasons. There seemed to be something European and kind of un-American about the government forcing people into the army. Also, you know how you rarely get something right the first time you try it? The same thing here for the draft on both sides. In both the North and the South, the wealthier people had ways to get out of the draft, where the poorer people did not. In the North, a guy had to be a guy. We didn't have women fighting in the war, and we've never actually had a draft that included women. Anyway, a guy could do a couple of things if he was drafted. He could hire a substitute. You're thinking, who would allow himself to be hired and then maybe get killed? How many poor starving Irish immigrants did you say there were? Yeah, it was those people. If you got a nice chunk of cash by taking another guy's place, then you could take good care of your family. Also, by the later stages of the war, even a private in the Union Army made $16 a month, plus you got free uniforms, food, and shelter. $16 a month was actually good money in those days, so you could see how someone actually might be willing to allow himself to be hired as a draft substitute. Also in the North, if you got drafted, you could buy your way out. This was the government's way of raising more money. You'd be drafted, and if you can't find a substitute, no problem, just give $300 to the government and that's it. In the South, where manpower was much scarcer, getting enough soldiers proved to be a real problem. Sorry about that. Proved to be a real problem. As in the North, despite various inducements, the Confederates also needed a draft. The draft in the Confederacy also fell more heavily on the lower classes. As in the North, a drafted Southerner with other plans could hire a substitute or simply pay the government a large sum of money, and that was that. In addition, because of the eternal fear of slave rebellion, those who owned a fair number of slaves had automatic exemptions. The number of slaves needed for exemption was at first 15, later 20, and then, as we've seen, if you already owned even one slave, you were in the upper 25% of Southern society. And if so, that means if you had 15 or 20 slaves, you were really rich. So these laws are going to cause substantial resentment. Poor non-slave-holding Southerners bitterly and angry referred to these slave owner exemption laws as the 15 N-word laws and the 20 N-word laws. Okay, they actually used the word, but I know it's an offensive language, but of course sometimes you have to simply know what people said, and our recognition of a historical usage does not constitute approval of such usage. So obviously in the North and the South, someone in the upper middle class or upper classes could get out of the draft, but poor people could not, and this is going to cause resentment. In fact, in New York City in July of 1863, there was a massive anti-draft riot that went on for days and resulted in hundreds of deaths and injuries, and the riot was finally suppressed by thousands of Union soldiers. Now, luckily, about 90% of all soldiers in the Civil War on both sides were veterans, so the inequalities of the draft were somewhat less than they could have been. However, when the U.S. next used the draft in World War I, men could not hire substitutes or buy their way out, and obviously there's no exemption for slaveholders by then. So let us remember also that the North possessed the great advantages in the immigrants and free blacks. Even during 4 years of the war, nearly 1 million more immigrants poured into the North, so the hundreds of thousands of Irish, Germans, and so on who had fought for the North provided this enormous advantage. Similarly, starting in 1863, the Union Army accepted African Americans, and approximately 180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army. About 38,000 died. Unfortunately, these African Americans had to serve in racially segregated units, often led by white officers. That's what it says there in the bottom of my slide. I don't know if that cut off or not. Anyway, white and black Americans would not serve together in an integrated U.S. Army until President Harry Truman ordered it in 1948. That is after World War II. About 70,000 more African Americans served in the Navy or worked for the federal government in other capacities, however, so the advantages of population boosted by immigrants and African Americans helped carry the North to victory. So in raising money, both sides faced the same challenges, although the North had substantial advantages, as we noted. Basically, any government at any time can get more money for itself in only 3 ways: raise taxes, borrow money, or just print money. I'm going to go through each one of these methods and their risks. So, starting up top, the raised taxes. Americans, as you know, have never been much of a fan of taxation. Borrowing money, which comes through issuing and selling bonds, has always been more acceptable to Americans, but since the government has to pay interest on bonds and the interest rate has to be competitive, costs in the long run can be astronomical. Printing money is the easiest way to do it, but this vastly increases the money supply, which then causes inflation, which causes the value of money to decline. This can cause the government to just keep printing more, which only makes inflation worse and is an endless spiral. So as we're going to see, the North and the South used all of these methods with different degrees of success. So although it was prohibited by the Constitution at this time, the North imposed income taxes on individual Americans for the first time in U.S. history. And once the war was over, the courts did declare income taxes unconstitutional. In the North and the South, taxes of all sorts increased, but as always, most of the revenue on both sides came from selling bonds. Even in the wartime, Americans don't like taxes to get too high, but were usually willing to buy bonds to finance war, as though this is going to be the more popular way to go. Last but not least, both sides are going to print paper money, which are also known as greenbacks in the North due to the green ink. That's why today our money is often referred to as a greenback. Printing money is going to cause inflation in both the North and the South, and it is going to be far worse in the South. Over the 4 years of the war, inflation was about 80% in the North, meaning something that cost $1 in 1861 would cost $1.80 in 1865. That is fairly serious inflation, given that in the 1990s, inflation was at about 20 to 25% over the course of 10 years. However, even 80% is not too bad given the North's economy. In the South, where they printed $1 billion of paper currency, inflation from 1861 to 1865 was 9,000%. That is not a typo. That is not one of my little bonehead mistakes. No, you read that right. You heard that right. 9,000%. So a loaf of bread would cost $25 in the South by the end of the war. So as you can see, the money situation in the South is going to harm their war effort. So to conclude on production, while the North has some unhappy men drafted in the Army, and while the draft had some unfairness, most soldiers volunteered, 90%, and this was also the case for Southerners. The big Northern advantage, of course, came in the sheer numbers for, as noted, the North, with the manpower advantage of a little over 4 to 1. Financially, the North's advantage proved even more substantial, and while inflation became a little bit of a problem in the North, it was a disaster in the South, and it weakened the Confederacy considerably. And of course, as we've already talked about, the North's great advantage in factories and manufacturing allowed the North to produce virtually unlimited amount of war material, from uniforms and shoes to cannons and rifles and railroad equipment. The South, of course, struggled.